and welcome to the Campus Technology Insider Podcast. I'm Rhea Kelly, Executive Editor for Campus Technology and your host. It's a new year, and boy, if there ever was a year I was happy to see the end of, it was 2020. And looking forward in this time of continued uncertainty, it's natural to wonder what 2021 has in store. How will higher education evolve as we head into, hopefully, post-pandemic times? Is it even possible to make predictions with circumstances still in flux? For this episode of the podcast, I talked with Richard Garrett, Chief Research Officer at higher education research firm Eduventures, about his predictions for 2021, the impact of the pandemic on online learning and ed tech, and the opportunities he sees for higher ed in the coming year. Here's our chat. Hi, Richard. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
So here we are at the start of a new year, typically a time when we forecast trends for the year ahead. But coming out of 2020, truly a year that defied expectations, is it even possible to make predictions for 2021?
Well, it's certainly harder than usual. I mean, it's never easy. But on the one hand, yes, there's a lot more uncertainty than usual. But on the other hand, there's a lot more in play than usual. So in some ways, it gives us, trying to predict 2021, some headlines, some things that stand out, some things we know are on institutions' minds, some things that have been perhaps particularly challenging in 2020 that we think may rebound strongly as a result in 2021. So yes, inevitable uncertainty, but still lots of clues and tips for us to work with.
Yeah, lots of things to latch onto. I thought it was interesting, even EDUCAUSE with their top IT issues for the year, it was almost like they were hedging their bets with their three different scenarios of how, institutions might be responding, what they might be doing post-pandemic, the restore, evolve, and transform. I just thought that was an interesting way of looking at it.
Right. But I think it reflects the fact that we have in higher education in America huge range of institutions, great diversity of institutional types and missions and circumstances, and inevitably you will have, therefore, a variety of outcomes in any year, not least a momentous period like this one. So in that sense, I think it's not so much that the entire sector will somehow move in a similar direction. They may at a deep level, but I think it's more trying to tease out different scenarios for different institutions and what will be perhaps radical and momentous, but unusual, at least in the next 12 months, versus what may be rather mainstream and conservative and in fact attempting continuity pre-pandemic rather than anything radical. And then on the other hand, sort of more dire circumstances for perhaps more schools than we would have been used to in a normal year. But still, I think it's dangerous to imagine that just because we've had a unusual, once in a century year in 2020, inevitably every baseline, every norm in say higher ed must adjust, must change. I think there's as much resilience in the sector as lack of it, and there's a lot that's working well in the sector that people would generally want to maintain. So I do think it's accurate to say that last year will advance some things and put more pressure where there was some pressure and make life very difficult for more institutions than would have been the case. But I still think for most schools, the goal is broad continuity with adjustments, developments, sidebars that will help them longer term, but aren't really the goal for most schools. I think is not tear everything up and start again. It's take a hard look and perhaps advance things that were drifting and delayed, but they're still about ultimately revision and reform rather than radical revolution.
Mm-hmm. So, what would you say are some key areas where we can make reasonable predictions, or where predictions might be important to consider in terms of institutions' strategic planning?
Well, the fundamental question, I think, is enrollment. Past fall 2020, we had an unusual combination of trends at the undergraduate level, particularly for community colleges and adult learners. We saw unprecedented year-over-year declines, and that was clearly attributable to the pandemic. People who look to those kind of institutions or engage with higher ed at undergraduate level later in life, on average, tend to be less well off in industries more vulnerable to pandemic disruption, far less sure about, is this worth it? Can I afford it? How does it work? How do I apply? Which school to go to, et cetera, et cetera. So we saw something contrary to what we usually see in recessions, knowing that the pandemic created a whopping recession as well. Normally in recessions, higher ed enrollment goes up. The received wisdom is that higher ed is a refuge from a tough economy, and that relationship's held pretty well in recent decades. And similarly, when the economy is strong, enrollment goes down, which is what we have seen prior to the pandemic during the long expansion after the Great Recession, record-breaking expansion. So that was unusual. On the other hand, grad enrollment did what was expected. It grew more strongly because I think that population, they've got a bachelor's degree, they're often gainfully employed, they're often in jobs less impacted by the pandemic, and they therefore thought, okay, I can study online because it's quite normal at graduate level. I have the means to do so. I'm a pretty savvy consumer. And the pandemic is giving me a bit of a wake up call to say, okay, my job is not guaranteed. My industry is not necessarily stable. Technology disruption is coming in ways I can't quite foresee. So let me invest in my education, get that extra credential. It's bound to help me in the long run. So the question for fall 2021 is, do we sort of snap back to normal if vaccine rollout goes well and there's no more unusual strains that the vaccines can't handle? Then we might expect some of that pent-up demand that didn't enroll at undergrad level in fall 20 to enroll in fall 21. So I think for undergrad, again, assuming we have a smooth COVID exit, then I think at undergrad level, we'd probably see strengthening enrollment. At grad level, we might see a falling off somewhat in that growth just because you don't have that same energy from the pandemic. But I still think it'll be positive as it has been for the last few years. So I think there we can, based on what happened last year, look forward to this year and anticipate some sort of normalization of the enrollment trends, and everything else in higher ed largely will stem from how that enrollment trajectory plays out.
And how about community colleges? I know they saw the biggest decline last year. And do you see that getting back to normal this year?
I think in relative terms, again, if the pandemic permits, I think online learning is particularly challenging for the typical community college student who often doesn't have a great prior educational experience. It may be a long time since they enrolled. They may not be familiar or comfortable with online learning, or even if they are, the field of study that they're attempting may not be a good fit, or they may worry that online is somehow not value for money if they're unsure in the first place as to whether to invest in community college at all. So insofar as community colleges can resume their campus-based defaults with online certainly playing a significant role, community colleges have pioneered online learning in many respects. But I do think the combination of economic distress, online as default, was not a good look for community colleges. So I do think that enrollment will revive. And I don't see, there are alternatives to community colleges, coding boot camps, various online short-term job certificates, the revival of federal interest in apprenticeships. But so certainly there are alternatives that are quite attractive, but I think scale-wise, they don't come anywhere close to the range and number and distribution of community colleges. So I would say the most likely scenario, assuming the pandemic allows, is for community college enrollment to rebound quite strongly this fall.
Oh, that's good news for them. So, thanks to the pandemic, we've seen quite an evolution in online learning over the past year. So, from the emergency shift to remote instruction last spring to fine tuning instructional design for the fall and blended models like HiFlex. So, where is all this going in 2021?
Yeah, it's another fundamental question. And I think the answer will vary by institutional type, student level, student type. There isn't a one size fits all clearly. So I think if the typical institution, whether it's a community college or a research university or a liberal arts college, is still defined by the in-person bricks and mortar experience. And online learning, while over the years it's gradually supplemented that under certain circumstances, it hasn't really challenged it. And I don't think the pandemic experience fundamentally changes that situation. So I think for the typical institution defined by bricks and mortar, the students, certainly if we're talking about traditional age undergraduates, which is still the largest student population, the pandemic didn't convince them that they somehow wanted online. Generally speaking, at the margins, yes, but the typical traditional age undergrad was even more enamored of the campus and the social aspect of college and all being in one place at one time. And I think there's even been sort of nostalgia building for, I want that even more, sort of forgetting its drawbacks and talking up its advantages. So I think colleges will embrace that emotionally, if for no other reason. At the same time, I do think colleges will walk away from the pandemic saying, one, we need to be readier for disasters like this. This won't be the last time something happens. Hopefully, it won't happen on this global scale anytime soon, but hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, having a online version of the institution to fall back on at the flip of a switch almost is clearly operationally advantageous. And many institutions have pieces of that, but they didn't imagine having to, most of them, transform the entire institution online, in a matter of days. So I think there'll be some sort of contingency planning that will hopefully survive the complacency that will inevitably emerge and people forgetting and so on with the passage of time. I think the more interesting question, trickier question is, do institutions start to say, well, our entire offering needs to somehow become more online than it was before? And I think the question is, well, why would they do that? I think clearly online can widen access. It can help institutions add capacity if they're physically constrained by city zoning or bricks and mortar limits. So I think that's helpful. Cost control, I think many have found pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, online tends to inflate costs. But the question is that because of poor planning, duplication of effort, reinvention of the wheel, not really prioritizing cost control, and that's why online doesn't help with costs? Or is there something fundamental about teaching and learning in higher ed to do it well somehow requires a level of resource that technology can only enhance or reduce to a limited extent? And then the outcomes question, is online learning producing better learning, stronger completion rates? Again, I think the evidence is very ambiguous there. And is that because, again, implementation has been so disparate and, at least during the pandemic, emergency driven rather than sort of slow, steady, thoughtful? Or is there something about online that's inherently inferior? Some people would argue that you just don't have the pedagogical range, or you don't have the connection between faculty and student and student and student. So I think the pandemic has sort of thrown all these questions once again into sharp relief, but hasn't really answered them. So I think colleges are keen, certainly, to find ways to grow without inflating costs. They're keen to try and control costs so they don't have to keep raising tuition year after year or increasing financial aid. They're really keen to try and improve the student experience and improve outcomes and improve graduation rates. But it's still a little tricky to say, if I do X with online learning or this kind of online learning, I will guarantee this kind of outcome. There's so many variables: who's teaching it, who's designing it. So many things can interfere, as it were, with some sort of neat cause and effect. So I think, therefore, schools won't rush to some sort of model that's been perfected, because there is no such model. And the right model will vary by school and student and academic level. And we'll continue to see the sort of iterative experimentation that we were used to with online learning before the pandemic. So I think we'll see one or two institutions, and maybe that's an understatement, a handful of institutions emerge with something distinctive and interesting in terms of innovative use of online. But there'll be the exception that proves the rule, and the rule will be kind of business as usual, kind of, try it here, try it there, bottom up rather than top down, faculty led rather than institution led. And that just reflects the fundamentally unclear, uneven landscape in terms of, where is online learning really helpful? Where is it neutral? Where is it detrimental? And frankly, the pandemic has not really solved those problems, in my view.
Mm-hmm. I read, one of your recent blog posts. You talked about the University of Florida as an example of, sort of taking an innovative approach to online learning. So I was wondering if you could sort of walk us through that as an interesting example.
Yes, the reason I'm interested in University of Florida Online, as they're called, so this is the online campus of the University of Florida, the public flagship university in Gainesville. And that online entity started life in a kind of ordinary way, meaning it was an attempt to recruit adult learners and graduate students out of state, raise more revenue, subsidize the core business. It was, in a sense, imitating an approach to online learning, at least fully online programs, degree programs, that a number of other schools and to some extent states had done before. I think they quickly found that that was a tougher challenge than they were expecting. Market's very competitive, commoditized. Why pay out-of-state fees to attend University of Florida when your local flagship probably offers something much more affordable? They then stumbled upon the fact that a certain number of Florida residents, traditional age undergrads who had applied to the University of Florida Gainesville campus but had not been accepted or had been waitlisted or something, had enrolled in this University of Florida Online and had moved to Gainesville, were taking part in campus life as best they could, but were studying online and hoping that at some point they could transfer in sophomore year or later into a regular campus University of Florida student. And they realized that, wait a minute, this could be quite helpful to our institution as a whole. Like many public flagships, University of Florida is vastly oversubscribed at undergraduate level. Far more students would enroll there than the institution is able to physically accommodate. So online learning opens up access without the equivalent increase in cost. If you compare what the state has to subsidize for a University of Florida online student versus a University of Florida Gainesville student, there's no comparison. It's much, much more affordable for University of Florida online from the state's point of view. Similarly, if you're a University of Florida online student, you pay a lot less in tuition fees than you would if you were attending the traditional University of Florida. And it's still relatively early days. The institution only has a few thousand students. We haven't really seen, can it grow? Is there enough demand for it to get to 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 like some of the really big online players, and even bigger than that? And will the model hold up? Will quality be seen as sufficient? Will they be able to maintain low tuition? Will the state subsidy be able to stay there or even be withdrawn? All that's TBD. But I think the other intriguing thing about them is that they're very much trying to stress that their version of online learning is distinctive. It's not just adult-oriented online converted into some sort of 18-year-old friendly version without really changing anything. They're arguing that they are investing in synchronous learning to a greater extent than the asynchronous norm for adult learners. high production values in terms of video of faculty explaining ideas, concepts, formulae in a much more engaging and high quality way than the typical online course focused on adult learners. And they're also exploring opportunities to combine online learning and on campus for certain kinds of field work or hands-on experience. Again, it's early days. They're iterating their way to something interesting. But I think the fact that it's a public flagship, it's helping expand access, it's helping expand capacity at a much more affordable price to the students and the taxpayer. And it's an innovative version of online that I think does recognize what the typical 18-year-old wants from higher ed rather than what the typical 30-year-old wants from higher ed. And all of that to me is the kernel of some real innovation about what online learning can do in higher ed. And it's fascinating because it's attacking the mainstream. It's not all these ultimately peripheral markets of adult learners or grad students. It's the undergraduate traditional age core. And if we are expecting online learning to have any deep systemic impact on higher ed post-pandemic, I think it's this kind of initiative that we should focus on. So my prediction for the year is that one or two other public flagships will launch something similar to University of Florida Online, targeting traditional age undergrads and all those rationales that I just outlined.
Yeah, definitely an area to watch. Another area that we've seen, the pandemic has had a tremendous impact on the use of education technology, learning management systems, of course, video conferencing, etc. So, do you think that tech boom will continue this year?
I think it will to some extent. It's interesting. We work with a Canadian firm called List Ed Tech that specializes in tracking technology implementations across education systems. They do it globally, but they have particularly good data for the US higher education system. And therefore, we can see over time how many institutions have implemented a particular piece of technology, such as a video conferencing system or an LMS or a whole range of other things. Which kinds of institutions are they? And what does that trend tell us? And what we saw pre-pandemic was a steady increase in implementations across a whole range of technology types. And then it peaked in, I think, 2017, and then fell off a little bit. And then during the pandemic, surged back once again. And I think the question we have to ask is, how should schools and how should the edtech sector more generally think about ROI when it comes to all this implementation? There's no question schools have been buying stuff for the last couple of decades, and they've been buying a greater variety of stuff, uh, more specialized technology that tackles retention or career services or learning analytics. And the question is, with all that outlay, what do they get back from it? Do they ultimately improve performance in some way? Do they lower their costs? Can they employ fewer staff? How do we judge it? And we don't really have an easy way of judging it. But it was interesting that implementations peaked and then went down a bit. So was that schools saying, okay, we've got all the kit we can handle, let's implement it, let's integrate it, let's really understand it, let's revise our manual processes to take advantage of it, really trying to bed down and figure out, what do we buy this for, and are we getting good value for money? And the pandemic certainly exposed where there were gaps, where schools did not have a good video conferencing system or various other things that were prioritized. So post-pandemic, if schools sort of look and say, wait a minute, we've got even more kit than we had before, how are we going to justify this investment, knowing that higher ed has something of a spending problem, meaning that as a service, it's typically been challenging to automate aspects of the experience to lower costs without also being seen to lower quality. And no institution wants to lower costs and also lower quality, because in the end it will backfire. So I think the challenge is, how can schools get more value for money if they're on some sort of subscription license model? They're paying for this over the long term. Does the price increase with use, or is it a flat fee where they can gain some economies of scale as adoption increases? Are there still gaps in the portfolio that every school must have X, Y, or Z piece of kit, or is it only useful for certain schools under certain circumstances? Are the best resource schools buying everything, even though they may not need half of it, whereas the schools that really need help don't have the budgets? Do we have that kind of tension? So there's certainly plenty of schools that don't have plenty of certain kinds of kit, but I would still say that I would expect the implementation rate to go down again this year because schools are trying to get back to normal. Their budgets are under stress in many cases. They've struggled to really show cost savings as a result of technology, or if the savings are there, it's not as obvious as employing fewer people. It's some sort of attempt to say, well, the quality of the experience improved, or something indirect or qualitative, which is maybe real but is less tangible from the CFO's point of view. So I think the opportunity for edtech vendors is to say, can we better understand our best clients? How have they really implemented and embedded our tool? What have they done with it? What have we learned about functionality? And when it comes down to it, what can we really say was the benefit of them buying this from their point of view, from their students' point of view, from taxpayers' point of view? And I think the edtech industry inevitably isn't there yet. It's challenging. Higher ed doesn't understand half of this cause and effect either. But I think the best companies will, again, using their best clients, start to get a handle on this stuff in a way that is meaningful. Not just marketing rhetoric. Every company says, the impact was great, everyone loves it, but something more meaningful, substantive, serious research, independent research. Not to try and name and shame anyone if something's not working. This is complicated stuff, but just acknowledge that that's where the industry, meaning higher ed and edtech in partnership, needs to go if all of this implementation isn't to be looked back upon as, wait a minute, why did we jump into this tool or this partnership when we didn't really understand how we were going to measure success? We didn't really think about the cost side of it as well as the investment side of it. And as a result, we're in a tough spot financially, and then we're looking pretty hard at these spend lines. So I think that's the way it's going to go. But I don't think we'll see the same surge of investment this year as we did last year. Last year was a one-off, and the trend was down, and I think the underlying trend will resume for a bit.
Yeah, I really wonder about all of the sort of online collaboration tools that were so important during the period of remote learning. And there would have to be some sort of shift where they're still used to enhance, the on-campus courses. But we would need research to see if those actually make a difference in student success and things like that.
Right. I think that it's the classic higher ed problem of a very decentralized reality, meaning each faculty member has to ultimately decide, which tool do I use, and how do I use it, and when do I use it, and how do I adapt it to my particular field of study and student body, and how do the students engage? And all of those variables will play out in hundreds of thousands of circumstances all over the country, week after week. So to try and extrapolate some sort of simple, you do A and then B will happen, some sort of simple cause and effect, isn't realistic. So I think the question for institutions is there advantage in trying to be a little more coherent and cohesive and directive about our approach as an institution of a certain kind to teaching and learning? And therefore, if we have a agreed approach to teaching and learning, does that clarify how we might deploy online technology? And therefore, can we get faculty buy-in rather than resistance to the idea that it's helpful for everyone, students, faculty, and everyone else, to have a bit more common ground and sort of not templates in the best way, in the best sense of the word. Not to say every faculty member's course somehow has to be pre-programmed and canned. No one's saying that, but can certain aspects of it be standardized in the interest of quality and cost control and then leaving the faculty member free to extemporize and be themselves and draw on their expertise where the technology just can't standardize, shouldn't standardize, or it would be a bad outcome if it's somehow standardized. I think schools just haven't really culturally got their head around where is that middle ground. There's so much sensitivity around faculty autonomy, rightly so, but I think it's overdone. And if institutions can't own these fundamentals, teaching and learning, it's the heart of the institution. If they can't really articulate what they do in a way that doesn't make your eyes glaze over and sound like marketing speak, or sound like everyone else's statement, then to me they're leaving the core value on the table. They're saying we can't speak to the thing that we're supposedly defined by, because we have a culture that decentralizes, fragments that, and again, to some extent for good reason. But I think in a mass higher education system where we're teaching millions upon millions of students, we're trying to widen access to less well-prepared students, we're trying to control the cost and make it more affordable and accessible. It's pretty hard to do all of that good stuff if at the same time we're still kind of running around as an artisan model. That, again, it's not that it's a bad model, it's a very hard model to make consistently efficient and effective in the ways that it needs to be if we're to hit some of these ultimately challenging but essential goals.
So, thinking sort of broadly, what opportunities do you see for higher ed institutions in 2021? Or on the flip side, what risks do you see?
Well, one thing we haven't talked about is the new Biden administration, a Democratic administration. And in recent decades, we're used to, during Democrat administrations, there being much more emphasis on regulating higher ed or certain bits of higher ed. And during Republican, it tends to be a more laissez-faire type attitude. So I think one key fault line is, and now we're talking about certainly the for-profit higher education sector, but also other sort of innovative corners of the sector, such as schools that partner with so-called OPMs, online program management firms that help colleges develop, launch, market, run online degree programs that are often, as we talked about earlier, a great source of students and revenue and so on. So under the Obama administration, there were a whole raft of attempts to rein in for-profit excesses, which were genuine in many cases. And then under Trump, we've seen attempts to roll back some of that. In some cases, rightly. In other cases, it was more just a different outlook. So I think the question for the Biden administration is, does higher ed generally, and for-profits and OPMs in particular, need more regulation? Is higher ed somehow out of control in the sense that tuition just keeps going up and outcomes just aren't that good, and graduates are not getting jobs, and all those perennial problems that some past administrations have said, we're going to regulate our way out of it. We're going to set threshold standards. We're going to have performance-based funding. We're going to release rankings that will, exemplify the best and shame the worst institutions, and the market will follow, or will track programs based on the job performance and earnings of graduates, and we won't subsidize any that fall below a certain threshold. The former gainful employment regulations is an example of that. So I think the risk is that, personally, I think more regulation is in most cases not the answer, because it tends to result in game playing and a lot of bureaucratic complexity as people who don't like the regulations try and understand them and push back on them and neutralize them, and it ends up in a quagmire of its own making. And the underlying objective of trying to somehow rein in bad actors may still happen, but it creates a lot of unwelcome energy and distraction from some of these underlying things. So I think the opportunity under the Biden administration may be a return to a more investment-minded approach to higher education that we might have been used to a couple of generations ago, going back to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, the idea that higher education is fundamental to national health and economic health, and expecting individuals and families to pay for more and more of it as opposed to the taxpayer paying more and more of it. We've come to the end of that cycle, and we will return to the idea that in order to ensure access, quality, reasonable price point, the taxpayer really needs to step in to a greater extent. So in a climate of low interest rates, low inflation, certainly during the pandemic, there's been unprecedented levels of public borrowing without too much concern about how it's going to be repaid. And I wonder if that is the opportunity for higher education to embrace. I mean, institutions will obviously love more investment if they're beneficiaries of it. The risk, though, will be there's this sudden largesse for a few years, but if it's seen to have been wasted, squandered, only the elites got it, or whatever the downside narrative might be, then you could quickly have a return to a different way of thinking about higher ed. We need to starve the beast, as it were, and we need to stop all of these unaccountable elites wasting taxpayers' money on frivolous programming and all those stereotypes. So I really think 2021, in terms of the long-term trajectory of US higher education, may be much more important than 2020. 2020 was a shock to the system in unexpected ways. It was all hands on deck emergency management. I think 2021 could be pivotal. Again, will we return to an investment-minded approach to higher ed from the federal government and to some extent state governments if they get federal incentive and support? Or will we, again, I think, repeat the mistake of trying to regulate higher ed's problems away when the drivers are more complicated than anything a simple regulatory change could enact? So it's early days, we don't quite know, but my prediction would be that we're going to see a more active, interested, sort of long-term investment strategy from the federal government, which is something we have not seen in US higher education really for 50 years.
Yeah, definitely an interesting year ahead. Well, thanks, Richard. Really enjoyed having you on and getting your insights.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Rhea Kelly, and this was the Campus Technology Insider Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and Stitcher, or visit us online at campustechnology.com/podcast. Let us know what you think of this episode and what you'd like to hear in the future. Until next time.